Good afternoon. I'm particularly pleased to have been asked to introduce the 1973 Baker Lecturer at the School of Public Health. The Henry Brooks Baker Lecture has been held continuously at the School of Public Health now for 25 years. In 1948 was the first lecture, and has gone on every year since with a whole series of distinguished persons in the field of chest diseases and tuberculosis. The lecture honors the memory of Henry Brooks Baker, who was born in Vermont, came to Michigan at the age of 12, settled and grew up, did his studies and most of his work in Ingham County, living for a long period in Lansing. Dr. Baker, interestingly enough, started his early medical career studying, as so many physicians did in those days, by the method of apprenticeship, having been apprenticed to a Dr. Ira Bartholomew of Lansing. Dr. Baker finished his medical studies just shortly before the Civil War, entered the Civil War, became a field surgeon, and had a good deal of experience in the war with traumatic surgery, but also with problems of chest disease and problems of prevention. So that when he came back into practice in Michigan, he was full of zeal for prevention. He worked very hard at all sorts of preventive activities, and it was actually largely through Dr. Baker's efforts that the Michigan Department of Health was founded 100 years ago this year. I suspect that many of you know that the department is celebrating its centennial in a series of meetings, of citizens meetings and practitioners meetings, and then a general statewide meeting will be held this month to celebrate the department that Henry Brooks Baker was so instrumental in founding. He became the first secretary of the State Board of Health in 1873 and served in that post continuously for 32 years. Dr. Baker was a quite remarkable person. He was one of the founders of the National Tuberculosis Association. The National Tuberculosis Association, which is now the National Lung Association, is the parent national group to which the Michigan Lung Association, formerly the Michigan Tuberculosis and Respiratory Disease Association, formerly the Michigan Tuberculosis and Health Association, formerly the Michigan Tuberculosis Association, has always belonged. But we're very happy to have with the Michigan Lung Association the privilege of sponsoring this lecture. Today's lecturer, Dr. Keith Morgan, is well known to many of our faculty because of our own interest in the field in which he is now working in West Virginia. Dr. Morgan is presently professor of medicine at the West Virginia University School of Medicine in Morgantown. He has had a long experience in the problems of chest diseases. He's particularly interested in the field of the lung and has belonged to a number of specialized societies relating to this, and also relating not only to the lung but also to the lung as it is concerned with occupation and the environment and the working environment. He had his early training at the University of Sheffield, but fairly early on came to the United States at the University of Maryland, where he had advanced training, then went on the faculty there before he went to the University of University of West Virginia in 1967. That's a Freudian slip. I wish you were here, sir. And became professor of medicine in 1970. I'm very happy to present to you the 1973 Baker Lecturer, Dr. Keith Morgan.
Dr. Workmen, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your introduction. I'm sure I don't really deserve it. I am indeed flattered to be asked to deliver the Baker Lecture. I took the trouble to read a little bit about Henry Brooks Baker from the brochure which you were kind enough to send me. He's been described as a Yankee from Olympus. One hopes that it was not a feeling of noblesse oblige that brought him to Michigan. A description of Baker's many talents makes me only too well aware of my own inadequacies. All I can say about myself is that I am an expatriate Anglo-Welshman from the slag heaps of West Virginia. I note that Baker was in action in the Civil War against Morgan's raiders. As a latter-day Morgan, I hope my intrusion today will generate no such response. In my present capacity as Baker Lecturer, I confess to feeling a little like Zsa Zsa Gabor's seventh husband on the honeymoon night. I know what is expected, but how the devil do I make it original? On occasions such as this, one wonders what type of fare to serve. Does the audience crave something extraordinarily scientific? Do they want to know whether frequency dependence is a more sensitive method of detecting early occupational lung disease than is the determination of closing volume? Such esoteric discourses appeal to a limited minority and are understood by still fewer. Should one therefore choose a more general topic? If so, there's a tendency for the lecture to end up as a sententious sermon crammed full of the usual platitudinous claptrap. The audience is likely to have inflicted upon it such meaningless phrases as medicine is at the crossroads, medicine is an art as well as a science. We also talk about the changing face of modern medicine, and physicians need to become more involved, although with whom is seldom stated. The lecturer pours forth the loathsome effluent of gratuitous admonition, while most of the audience say, "Oh God, not again." Well, I'm going to attempt a middle course with the result that I'm probably going to fall between two stools. But one can console oneself by remembering that nothing ventured, nothing gained. Be it understood, however, that the views I express are entirely my own. Nothing so constructive ever came out of my employer, the Department of Health, Education and Welfare. You will appreciate why I want to see the text before I return. Certain occupations have been known for many years to lead to pulmonary impairment, respiratory disability, and death. George Bauer, alias Georgius Agricola, in the early 16th century wrote, "On the other hand, some mines are so dry that they are entirely devoid of water, and their dryness causes the workman even greater harm. For the dust which is stirred and beaten up by digging penetrates into the windpipe and lungs and produces difficulty in breathing, and a disease the Greeks call asthma." This description was written a few years after Columbus discovered America. As Dr. Higgins said, perhaps he sailed too far. Where is he? He will probably not forgive me for that. It may seem peculiar to realize that the U.S. had to wait until 1969 before the Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act was passed, this being the first piece of major federal legislation designed to safeguard the health of the miner. Now, coal workers' pneumoconiosis is a disease produced by the inhalation of coal dust. It is recognized by certain distinctive features in the chest film and an appropriate history of exposure. It is divided into two types, simple and complicated pneumoconiosis. The former is recognized by the extent and profusion of small opacities that are present on the chest film. It is further subdivided into categories 1, 2, and 3 according to the profusion of these categories. Now, I would like to show you a nice slide with showing categories 1, 2, and 3 of a real X-ray. Unfortunately, the real X-ray displays very poorly, and so you will excuse me if I give you this very diagrammatic representation of the three categories. Category 1, 2, and 3, and they're really recognized, as I indicated, by the number of small opacities present on this film. So, now why is it important to look at these opacities? Why is it important to categorize them? Well, there's a direct relationship between the category of simple pneumoconiosis and the coal dust content of the lungs. May I have the next slide, please? This is cribbed from the Safety in Mines research establishment work that has been conducted out in conjunction with the PRU over many years. The fact that you can divide category 0 into 3 subcategories and category 1 into 3 subcategories really matters very little. This is the coal content of one lung. These are the number of lungs that have been analyzed, post-mortem figures running up here. You will observe that there is an almost straight-line relationship between the coal content of one lung and the X-ray category here. So it is useful to do this to give us some idea of how much coal is in the lung and to let us understand which men are at risk. Now, complicated pneumoconiosis is recognized by the presence of a large opacity or opacities greater than 1 centimeter in diameter and occurring on a background of simple pneumoconiosis. Complicated pneumoconiosis occurs on a background of usually of categories 2 or 3 simple pneumoconiosis. I can show you a better slide, if I may please, of this, of a real X-ray. You can see this is of a working miner. Even so, it doesn't project very well. But you can see these large conglomerate opacities in this region here. This man was working, but he has complicated pneumoconiosis. And as such, this disease is likely to interfere with his capacity to work. It is likely to lead to respiratory impairment, and it might well lead to premature death. Well, what effect does pneumoconiosis have on lung function? And I'm now mainly talking about simple pneumoconiosis. Over the past 4 years, the Appalachian Laboratory for Occupational Respiratory Disease, which is part of the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, has been, perhaps we could have the lights on, if you don't mind. I think the remainder of the slides will be visible. Has been studying the respiratory health of a group of working coal miners. These miners are drawn from 9 states and 31 separate coal mines. Each miner was offered a chest X-ray and some simple tests of ventilatory capacity at no expense to himself. A respiratory questionnaire was administered and a complete occupational history was taken. The examinations are to be repeated at 3 and then 5-year intervals. In the first round, over 90% of the miners approached participated in the study. If one relates a simple test of ventilatory capacity, such as the FEV1 or the FVC, to radiographic category, then it becomes apparent that these tests of bellows function are unaffected by increasing category of simple pneumoconiosis. And I have already shown that the increasing category means that there is more dust present in the lungs. However, the onset of complicated pneumoconiosis leads to a significant decline in the FEV1 and other indices of ventilatory capacity. May I have the next slide, please? I apologize to you, those who saw this earlier. You're right, the lights do have to go off. Here we have them subdivided according to region. These are all minors, anthracite minors, all bituminous, and Appalachia, Midwest, etc. These are the radiographic categories: 0, 1, 2, 3 of simple, progressive massive fibrosis or complicated pneumoconiosis. This is the FEV1. Seems to have got the itch, the slide, isn't it? Mean FEV1 corrected for age and everything else that one can correct for, with the exception of smoking. There really isn't much difference in smoking habits across the way. You will see that simple pneumoconiosis is not associated with any significant decrement in ventilatory capacity until you get to progressive massive fibrosis, where there is a definite and substantial decrement as far as the ventilatory capacity is concerned. The reason why PMF is not shown on these slides, on these two bars out here, is there weren't enough cases in the far west to be statistically significant. I think there was only one there and about 3 in the Midwest. May I have this next slide, please? This shows exactly the same thing for the FVC. Again, there is no real decrement in the FVC with increasing category. This is the forced vital capacity, which, as you all know or should know, is a simple test of ventilatory capacity and is what is done with the spirometer. May I have the lights again, please? Although the FEV1 and FVC are only 2 tests of pulmonary function, no matter what tests are used, simple pneumoconiosis appears to be associated with only minor abnormalities of pulmonary function, which in themselves are never sufficient to produce respiratory disability. In contrast, complicated pneumoconiosis leads to premature disability and death. I would stress that this is not invariably so, but in a substantial proportion of subjects, this is true. But I would ask you to remember the distinction between respiratory impairment and respiratory disability. Impairment means an abnormality of pulmonary function. Respiratory disability means an inability to work because of respiratory impairment. Thus, the few minor impairments that occur in co-workers' pneumoconiosis, or at least in simple co-workers' pneumoconiosis, do not lead to significant shortness of breath, except at levels of exercise which only a professional athlete uses. Remember also that the same impairment does not necessarily lead to the same disability. For example, a ballet dancer who loses her leg has a certain amount of impairment and must be regarded as completely disabled for her job, while a civil servant such as myself, or many administrative folks who perhaps may be here, if he were to lose his leg, is probably at an advantage. Since, as everybody knows, in this occupation, if you stick close to your desk and never go to sea, you'll become the ruler of the Queen's Navy. Well, that's paraphrasing it from Gilbert and Sullivan. But at least you'll become a bureaucrat of major proportions. How is a disabled miner compensated? The Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Acts of 1969 and 1972 provided compensation for coal miners disabled by coal workers' pneumoconiosis or black lung, whatever the latter term means. Under the 1969 Act, compensation was awarded to miners who have either complicated pneumoconiosis, and there can be no argument there, or who have simple pneumoconiosis plus a certain reduction of their ventilatory capacity. This reduction being related to the miner's height. Obviously, his ventilatory capacity and his FEV1 are related to his age and height. Thus, it can be seen that the federal regulations accepted a cause and effect relationship between the decreased ventilatory capacity and the radiographic abnormalities seen in the chest film in simple poll workers' pneumoconiosis. Yet there is no evidence to suggest that impaired ventilatory capacity is in any way related to the radiographic diagnosis of simple poll workers' pneumoconiosis. As a result of the regulations, many men were compensated for the effects of chronic bronchitis and emphysema, namely for cigarette smoking. But just as many men were denied compensation because although they had ventilatory impairment, their X-ray was within normal limits. The miners themselves could not understand such a distinction, and indeed it is difficult not to be sympathetic to their viewpoint. If two coal miners have worked at the same coal face for 30 years, and both are short of breath, both have cough and sputum, although only one has X-ray evidence of pneumoconiosis, it is quite natural for them to believe that their symptoms are a consequence of their occupation. Indeed, they have been almost encouraged to think so. Complaints about compensation under the 1969 Act were loud and long. And as a result, the 1972 Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act came into being. The second act changed the law so that no miner could be refused compensation on the basis of a negative chest X-ray alone. It was assumed that any respiratory disability found in a coal miner who'd worked in an underground mine for 15 years was related to his occupation unless there was evidence to the contrary. This again seems an unwarranted assumption, but one cannot wonder whether it is any more far-fetched than the assumed association between ventilatory impairment and radiographic category that came into being as a result of the 1969 Act and the subsequent regulations published by Social Security. Coal miners have long been known to have more bronchitis and a lower ventilatory capacity than do comparable groups of non-miners. The reduction of ventilatory capacity is minimal, but has been evident in most studies. What is it about the occupation of coal mining that leads to these phenomena? There is good evidence, both from Britain and the USA, that industrial bronchitis is the culprit. While cigarette smoking is of paramount importance in the genesis of bronchitis in coal miners, dust inhalation plays a role, especially in the non-smoker. Industrial bronchitis occurs independently of coal workers' pneumoconiosis, and needless to say, leaves no radiographic stigmata. It is probably produced by larger particles that settle in the conducting system of the lung, that is to say, the part of the lung which is not concerned with gas exchange itself. Such particles are removed by the mucociliary escalator and no trace remains. If one divides the mining population according to the dustiness of their job, there is a gradient from the most dust at the face, that is to say the area where the coal is actually removed from the coal face, through slightly less dust on transportation. Once the coal has been dug from the coal face, it is loaded onto small trains or conveyor belts and moved backwards. There is less dust on transportation, but there is still some. There is less still on the maintenance. The people have to maintain the tracks, they have to rock dust and do other jobs there. So this, further back you go from the face, there is less dust. And needless to say, there is least dust on the surface. While the degree of dust exposure seems to make little difference to the prevalence of bronchitis in smokers, a significant effect is apparent in the non-smokers. May I have the next slide, please? Perhaps we could dim the lights. This is a somewhat complicated slide. This refers to the percentage of subjects with bronchitis. Here we have surface, other, maintenance, transportation, and face workers. In other words, there is a transition or a gradient from least dust to most dust. These are the years of mining experience. These are smokers, and non-smokers are represented below. We left the ex-smokers out because they're somewhat in between and indeterminate. But if you look at the non-smokers, in every instance, or almost every instance, and here this is less than 10 years exposure, so some of these numbers are relatively small. But if you look at the prevalence of bronchitis as recognized by cough and sputum, you will observe that there is more in general in those who work at the face than in those who work at the surface. And this holds true except in odd areas where there are relatively small numbers of samples. In general, those who work at the face have more. This is less apparent in the, it is still apparent, but it is somewhat less apparent in the smokers. So one can say from this that in general, those miners who work at the coalface have more bronchitis. May I have the next slide? These are only symptoms. If you then look at the prevalence of obstruction, and we are now talking about an FEV1 over FVC as an index of obstruction, and the values were related to the iron and steel community's predicted values. What one sees here is that obstruction is much more frequent in smokers, right the way across. But these are face workers here. These are the percent obstructed. Face, transportation, maintenance, miscellaneous underground jobs. This is electricians and people who look after the cage that goes up and down. And here we have surface workers. But you will observe that in the non-smoking group here, as compared with the non-smoking face workers, as compared with the non-smoking surface workers, there is a slight disparity between the percentage. This actually is significant, and if you look at the FEV1 or the FEV1 over FVC, it is just significant. I would point out, however, that it is a minimal reduction. It is not a significant reduction in the sense that it is clinically significant, but it is statistically significant. May I have the lights again, please? A slight decrease in ventilatory capacity is thus associated with increased dust exposure. But the effects of cigarette smoking outweigh the effects of dust by about 5 to 1. How then does one decide how much of a miner's disability is related to his occupation? Unless one can say with a reasonable degree of certainty what percentage of the man's disability is related to his occupation, then workman's compensation becomes a hit-and-miss guess, and as such, a lucrative verbal exercise for wily lawyers. And at this junction, let it be recognized that the federal government's compensation for black lung is a form of workman's compensation. Black lung, and I use this term to mean any type of respiratory disability occurring in a coal miner, and which should not be confused with the specific disease coal workers' pneumoconiosis, is not the only condition in which it is difficult to apportion blame in regard to the effects of occupation versus other factors. When lung cancer develops in a construction worker who's exposed to asbestos, can one say that it is his industrial exposure that is responsible? Asbestos exposure definitely plays a role, but cigarette smoking is probably more important. How much of the obstruction seen in a cigarette-smoking cotton worker is due to bicynosis? and how much due to his passion for the pernicious weed? It is easy to cite numerous other examples where occupation is one of several factors playing a role in the pathogenesis of disease. Immediately springing to mind are the association between silicosis and tuberculosis, the development of lung cancer in cigarette-smoking uranium miners, and the association between bronchitis and dust exposure in the way that I've just shown you. How does one apportion blame? Well, the lawyers can tell you they do it by expensive legal arguments that divert a substantial proportion of the award away from the disabled man. Those of us who are physicians are often told that we bury our mistakes. Please bear in mind that lawyers live off theirs. I trust there are some present. It is difficult to imagine a physician accepting custom on a contingency basis, and yet this is routine for lawyers. And I don't know whether you know what a contingency basis is, but when a patient consults one doesn't guarantee him a cure. It would be rather futile to do so. Well, prior to 1900, a worker who was disabled by industrial injury or accident could obtain recompense only through lawsuits based on either common law or, in some jurisdictions, employers' liability statutes. Under common law, the plaintiff had to prove the employer's negligence, and this, coupled with several other factors, militated greatly against the worker. Thus, there was a reluctance on the part of fellow workers to testify against the employer, lest by doing so they placed their jobs in jeopardy. Moreover, 3 defenses were available to the employer which were used to deny claims made upon him. Namely, the worker by his own negligence contributed to his injury. Second, that damages could not be recovered if a fellow worker was responsible for the injury. And thirdly, the injured employee could not be awarded compensation if he knew ahead of time of any inherent hazard in his employment. He didn't even have to know of the inherent hazard. All the employer had to say was he should have known of the inherent hazard, and that was sufficient defense to exonerate the employer. During the 1850s, the obvious inequities of common law led to the employer's liability laws. These laws, although an improvement, still placed on the injured workman the onus of proving the employer had been negligent. By 1900, it was apparent that legal remedies for industrial injury were grossly inadequate. High legal costs were the rule, and the employee often did not have the financial backing necessary for him to bring suit against the employer. As a result, which were used to deny claims made upon him. Namely, the worker by his own negligence contributed to his injury. Second, that damages could not be recovered if a fellow worker was responsible for the injury. And thirdly, the injured employee could not be awarded compensation if he knew ahead of time of any inherent hazard in his employment. He didn't even have to know of the inherent hazard. All the employer had to say was he should have known of the inherent hazard, and that was sufficient defense to exonerate the employer. During the 1850s, the obvious inequities of common law led to the employer's liability laws. These laws, although an improvement, still placed on the injured workman the onus of proving the employer had been negligent. By 1900, it was apparent that legal remedies for industrial injury were grossly inadequate. High legal costs were the rule, and the employee often did not have the financial backing necessary for him to bring suit against the employer. As a result, between 1900 and 1920, most states passed workmen's compensation laws. The prime purpose of these states was to provide adequate benefits while limiting the employer's liability to workmen's compensation payments. In other words, there was a limit to the amount the man could be paid, but in most instances it was reasonably adequate. These payments or premiums were to be predetermined so as to avoid uncertainty for both the injured man and the employer. Appropriate medical care was to be provided and costly litigation averted. Most important of all was the establishment of the principle of liability without fault. The cost of compensation was to be assigned to the employer, not because he was always culpable, but because of the inherent risks of industrial employment. Thus, assent was given to the concept that wards for industrial injury and sickness were part of the costs of production. That the introduction of workmen's compensation laws was a tremendous social advance should be self-evident, but it has become apparent in the last few years that present laws have grave deficiencies. I should like to say a few words about some of them. Firstly, the number of employees covered by workmen's compensation. At present, only 85% of employees are covered by state and federal programs. This figure is unsatisfactory, and in some states, little over 50% of the workforce is covered. Those excluded are usually the lowest paid and most in need, namely farm workers, employees of small firms, and casual workers. In this regard, many states still allow elective coverage. Secondly, the variation in injuries and diseases covered. There is no uniformity from state to state as to the disease or injuries that are covered or regarded as occupationally related. Thus, some states do not recognize either byssinosis or silicosis as occupational diseases. Farmer's lung, perhaps a relatively common condition at least in adjacent states, is seldom covered. Moreover, benefits for the same degree of disability vary widely from state to state, and in some areas or in some states are grossly inadequate. There is a regrettable but easily understood tendency for industry to move to those states where workmen's compensation laws are least generous. The worst example of lack of uniformity has come about with the passage of the Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act, and I've already touched upon this. This act placed the responsibility for paying awards for black lung on the federal government and hence on the U.S. taxpayer. And it amounts, ladies and gentlemen, to almost $1 billion this year. Nonetheless, although black lung benefits are a form of workmen's compensation, in this case the coal companies are not bearing the expense. But even were they doing so, they would be compensating most men for the effects of cigarette smoking. An inequitable situation has resulted in which many disabled coal miners receive greater financial compensation than other disabled workers. Federal black lung benefits are markedly more generous than are the ordinary benefits paid by Social Security for premature and total disability. In addition, the coal miner is also usually entitled to a substantial award from the state workmen's compensation laws. At the present time, a disabled byssinotic cardroom worker from North Carolina receives about a third of the compensation that a coal miner from Kentucky with the same degree of disability receives. I have already shown you that the coal miner's disability is less likely to be related to his occupation. You might well then ask, where then is the logic or the justice in this situation? Thirdly, provision of medical care and rehabilitation services. At present, the workmen's compensation provides reasonable cover for medical care, but only 20% of beneficiaries receive any form of vocational rehabilitation. Granted, the above described inadequacies exist in the present system for the compensation of industrial injury and accidents. What can be done to correct the situation? Several alternatives are worth consideration. First, what about individual reforms by the states? Past experience suggests that the states are unlikely to introduce of their own volition the necessary reforms which would lead to a uniform and adequate system. Many states have been deterred by the specter of industry migrating elsewhere. In addition, tendentious and biased arguments and lobbying are inflicted on all the state legislatures by both labor and industry, with the result that the status quo usually persists. Next, it's been suggested that the recommendations be made to the states by a federally appointed commission. This is unlikely to be successful for the same reasons stated in the previous section. Third, it has been proposed that state action be mandated by Congress. It has been suggested that reforms could be effected through Congress enacting certain minimum standards of workmen's compensation laws. This alternative would certainly do something to achieve uniformity and would result in an elimination of many of the present inequities. However, this type of mandatory state action would probably necessitate financial assistance from the federal government, and at present I don't think there's much hope of that. The cost of such half measures might well be excessive, and the system, although improved, would still probably be inadequate in certain areas. Finally, one can think about replacing the present system by a federal program. This alternative has obvious attractions, since it would lead to complete uniformity. However, the means of financing such a program presents problems. Nonetheless, such systems are the rule in most advanced civilized societies, and I feel the introduction of a federal program is inevitable in the USA. All of these alternatives are discussed in some detail in the report of the National Commission of State Workmen's Compensation Laws. This commission was appointed by the President and Congress, and its findings were published in July '72. The commission, while recognizing the deficiency in the present system, did not recommend a federal system, but rather the extension and improvement of the state workmen's compensation laws, at the same time conceding, and they didn't concede this very overtly, but there was a concession, that the capacity for such reform was probably lacking. Inherent in any civilized society is the tenet that such a society should provide its disabled members with sufficient financial support for the necessities of life. Ethically and morally, it matters little whether the disability is industrially acquired or not. If this doctrine is accepted, the same impairment and the same disability should receive the same compensation. Were this so, the loss of a leg or eye, or the presence of a certain degree of respiratory impairment, should result in the same compensation, no matter how the injury or disease originated. This precept has partial acceptance in the present social security system, in that the present social security system provides compensation for premature disability, irrespective of cause. However, as described earlier, the coal miner who is totally disabled by respiratory impairment receives greater financial compensation than does the equally disabled farm worker or steel worker, despite the fact that their needs are just the same. These anomalies could be corrected by a federal system that awards equal compensation for equal disability. Such a system should be administered and financed in a fashion similar to Social Security. This would necessitate that an accurate assessment of the frequency of industrial injury and disease be made throughout the nation. Based on actuarial data,
price and usually put out about washing loads a day.
That portion of each person's that is put towards premature.
That's what I feel sorry about. I can't.
The accounts be established for.
Didn't say. The only one taking.
The employer is compelled.
That's with the
disease. Employers
sometimes hold a job if you not going to have a job that's going to pay you your expenses for a babysitter, which would cost quite a bit.
and would eliminate much of the present tedious and expensive litigation that takes place. It would also make certain that disability awards remained with two lawyers who in the space of something like a year and a half made over $1 million each from black lung compensation from minors by taking cases on a contingency basis. I would point out to you that this seems somewhat iniquitous and that the man himself should benefit more substantially from this award. In conclusion, it only remains to be said that compensation for industrial injury and disease has too long been in the province of the legal profession alone, a fact that is emphasized by the present haphazard and inadequate system. The medical profession would do well to recall Ramazzini's apothegm. Medicine, like jurisprudence, should make a contribution to the well-being of the worker. I thank you for your indulgence. Dr. Higgins didn't really say that, it was mine. I hope you'll forgive me for maligning him. Thank you very much.
Dr. Morgan's fascinating presentation to us of an aspect of prevention and public health which we don't always see. We're interested in preventing disease, but when disease occurs, compensation for it is equally important. We have a few minutes left. Dr. Morgan would be happy to answer any questions or make further comments for those of you who wish to raise them. Yes.
Much of the problems they were asserting in their respiratory illnesses, especially bronchitis from smoking rather than from...
Hold us, yeah.
Okay. Do you have control in a non-mining population? So I'm wondering if the combination of smoking and you might have some effect, in which case it seems like they would have some claim to workers' compensation as well.
Well, it's difficult getting controls, but I think that slide that I showed about industrial bronchitis makes quite clear the fact that some of their symptoms and a little bit of their impairment is related to the inhalation of dust. It's quite true that dust does have a bad effect, and obviously I'm not in favor of dust. And neither am I in favor of saying that you shall not smoke if you're a minor. I think this is the man's choice, and far be it from me I'll tell him what's good for him, but I think it was Oscar Wilde said the only thing you can possibly do with good advice is to pass it on.
Yeah.
Is any of the impairments reversible?
Yes, I think probably some of the impairment. Certainly if a person stops smoking, the symptoms tend to clear up, the cough and sputum. I think it's very much more doubtful whether his obstruction will clear up. I am not certain that the same can be said of the obstruction due to the inhalation of dust. I have a suspicion, and it is only an impression, that were he to cease to be dust exposed, his symptoms of bronchitis would improve, and possibly his pulmonary, possibly the minor degree of obstruction that he has might be reversible. This is surmise.
Yes.
Do you favor strip mining?
Yeah, I thought for the moment you were going to say, do I favor stripping?
Does he ask?
That's a difficult question to answer at present. I'd point out to you that something like 40% of the coal that we use, and you wouldn't have any lights here, and I might inform you that if you didn't have any lights and didn't have any other things, you'd be even more short of gas than you are now, because oil would have to go to provide lights, does come from coal. Ideally, I don't favor it. Ideally, I think it is a blot in the escutcheon. And were it possible to have deep mining, I would much prefer it. But for the time being, I think the energy crisis is going to dictate that strip mining persists. But certainly, I hate to see what it has done to West Virginia.
That's good. I meant it as let's say, as a preventive measure. Would you prefer that people were...
The strip mining do less?
No, I wouldn't. I think if you look at the injuries that occur in strip mining, they're probably as great, considering the lesser number of men employed, as they are underground. No, I don't think that's an answer. And what is more, I hate to see what it is doing to some of the more beautiful parts of the USA.
Yes?
Do you either have information or could you speculate on the effect of particulate matter as pollution in cities on people's...
You know, I could speculate indefinitely, but I hesitate to do so because, especially in the presence of Dr. Higgins, who's probably more knowledgeable than anybody else around here. As far as I'm concerned, air pollution probably presents some minor potential hazards to health, but in comparison to many other factors about which we know, they are relatively minor. They are not pleasant. Nobody wants to look at Los Angeles or inhale Los Angeles smog, but the evidence to show that it has a permanent and deleterious effect in the lungs is, in my opinion, tenuous. But I really think that you should direct that question to your revered teachers here.
Dr. Higgins, Dr. Morgan, Dr. Higgins. We'll include Dr. Higgins with us, both Dr. Higgins. Thank you very much again for a fascinating speech, and you've awakened a lot of questions in our group. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Very enthusiastic, as you can see, about a Department of Health. And there's 3 minutes more left, so who would like to ask me a question? Yes, sir.
How is determined in time that who is determined where these bills go, what committee they go to?
Yes. There is a parliamentarian of the House and the Senate, and unless you appeal from the decision of the chair, which is done once every 100 years, the decision of the parliamentarian following the law, which says there's a law passed by Congress called the La Follette-Monroney Act of 1946, as amended, which says that the Ways and Means Committee shall have jurisdiction over taxes, tariffs, reciprocal trade, Social Security. So when a bill comes up, he looks at it and says, is it Social Security? If it is, Ways and Means. Now you get many times some neat decisions. Back in the 40s, we took the Wagner-Murray-Dingle bill. How many people know what the Wagner-Murray-Dingle bill is? Raise your hand. Oh my. You see how difficult it is for us older people when you younger people don't even know what happened in the last 25 years. Because you think everything started in 1970. It was amended, which says that the Ways and Means Committee shall have jurisdiction over taxes, tariffs, reciprocal trade, Social Security.
Where these bills go, what committee they go to?
Going to dictate that strip mining persists.
I was rather relieved when the payment incentive didn't increase payment. To alleviate our expire problem, that is everybody falling off the inventory at the same time, we offered a collect extension offer on all of our bills. The offer was 4 additional issues for $3. That was a 25-cent break in copy rate, and this enabled us to extend a good portion of our inventory out beyond the September drop period. To get an early reading on renewals, we promoted a group of subscribers at 6 months for $6. While we knew that these people would probably not renew as well as our basic charter subscribers who had a year for $12 offer, because they would have seen fewer issues and because they would have paid less money to begin with, we felt that at least we could see a trend. We're in the middle of that renewal exercise now. We've done some some phone calling or some surveying of renewers and non-renewers on the 6-month group. And the survey has shown that the demographics of the renewers are much higher than the non-renewers. Also, interestingly, that a higher percentage of the renewers are female. Perhaps this indicates that money is still having some growing pains, some pains defining its audience, which is really, I think, quite small, select group of people, people at whom it is aimed. We are currently doing an advanced renewal effort, and here I'll ask for your expertise. The advanced renewal effort is going to all of our charter subscribers who don't expire until the end of September. We've never done an advanced renewal act at Time Incorporated before, or maybe we did, I don't know, 25 years ago for Time or something of that sort, but we haven't done it recently. And I think I'm pleased on any basis that I have to judge that effort, one effort now to people who don't expire until September, is pulling almost 20% to date and will probably final, I would think, close to 30%. I think that's good. That's the first effort, and they haven't begun to get their renewal serious yet. But as I said, if anyone has any experience with advanced renewals, I'd be glad to hear about it. There is one thing, before I forget to tell you, that would be a good idea if you ever launch a new magazine, and that is you could manage probably to send them your own product. We had, in 2 cases, things happen such as on our first October issue, our Canadian subscribers were getting their magazine out of our plant in Albany, and there aren't that many Canadian subscribers, luckily, but they were all sent American Girl, which is another magazine printed by our printer. And I got this one irate letter from a subscriber, a woman who said, I've seen just about everything, but I don't want American Girl. I have subscribed, to Money Magazine, and if you're not really publishing it, just let me know. After we got over that little hassle, we sent our international subscribers Sports Illustrated, which at least was, good promotion somewhere in the company. I don't know. But, well, actually, that basically completes Money's launch story. But I'd like to take you through the recent direct mail test we did, because I think we learned quite a bit from it.